How do we grow this influence of black leaders, men and women, that can represent our industry inside the ANC, inside the policy-making structures?
Get to grips with the digital environment, put together best practices, what works and what doesn't, very importantly.
In the project that we're doing in Catalytic, we've created a linking bridge between those two little areas there. So it becomes a matter of just 10 minutes walk from one side to the other.
So my message to our CEOs and those chief investment officers is, where at the end of the day do you want to see your role?
So by treating all of our water back to a stage where we can bring it back into the process, we're in effect saving around about 35% of our water usage on site.
Welcome to greeneconomy.tv. I'm your host and facilitator for today, Byron McDonald. It's another episode of The Circular Show. Yes, metals and the circular economy part 2. And we have our regulars on board. That's Chris Whyte and Nolwazi Mbhele. Today, we might not have Gordon Brown on because he went for that jab, being a bit irresponsible, as we also shall say. So let's go ahead.
This show is brought to you by GBCSA's Positive Impact Magazine.
Hey Chris, hey Nolwazi, how are you doing?
Hey Byron, hey Nolwazi.
Good. So Chris, we have you to protect us today. We don't have Gordon on the side. We're speaking about metals and the circular economy. Just to get into it, Chris, kind of an introduction where we left off last week with metals and the circular economy. If you can go ahead, we can just get into this topic.
No problem. So basically, metals is a complicated topic, which is why we split this into two. So last week, we really looked at the broader spectrum metals recycling, as many people would understand. So we see scrap recyclers all over the place, and we see trolleys running up and down the road with our collectors with any piece of scrap metal that either should or shouldn't be in there, that's going off to the conventional metal recycler. So that really is more about the ferrous market metal, steel, iron. So the idea now is to start looking at the second component of metals, which is the non-ferrous. And that can be split into a number of different categories. I'm not going to get into too much of a complicated sort of chemistry component of it, but our main applications in terms of non-ferrous metals are copper and aluminium. Now, anybody who's in that market at the moment will know that copper and aluminium are at the highest prices ever at the moment. And this has knock-on effects. It has knock-on effects with the fact that Telkom and Eskom keep losing their cables to our illegal collectors. But it's also because there's such high value in it. And it's really being driven by the green economy. So people often say, the green economy, it's more circular, it's more environmentally friendly. Well, absolutely it is. But it needs materials as well. And copper and aluminium are two of the key elements in this transition to a circular economy. Just think about a solar panel. Solar panel has got an aluminium frame. It's got copper wiring in it. So all of these different elements, whether you're talking about a wind turbine, or a solar panel, it needs copper and aluminium. But on top of that, it needs other materials. And these are what we would call the critical raw materials, or getting down into more detail, something what we call rare earth elements. And there's a number of different applications there, which some people might know, sort of tantalum, niobium, cesium, molybdenum, and different components to that. But what we want to try and do today is we want to unpack the circular economy perspective and get to understand what the secondary materials are, as opposed to everyone thinks about iron ore. Let me put into perspective for you. I've got some prices up on my computer at the moment. Right now, as of today, if you look at industrial metals, iron ore is coming through at about $215 a ton. You compare that to aluminium, which is $2,500 a ton. It's 10 times the value. Copper is at $9,700 a ton. And that has implications. I read a story earlier today that there's a huge increase in hijackings on these copper trucks that roll through South Africa down towards the Durban port. And it's because it's just become such a highly valuable metal. But it also has implications in terms of, obviously, the sabotage and destruction where people are stealing cables illegally.
That's right.
But there's a lot of different opportunities to look at that from a different perspective. The one is that obviously copper and aluminium prices at a high level provides a greater incentive for more formal recycling opportunities. And we need to look at that as a critical application opportunity in circular economy. So if you look at aluminium is, we've got a very successful process in South Africa in terms of aluminium can recycling. And the reality is that at the value of the cans, every collector is looking for them. So there is no issue in terms of recycling aluminium cans because there's a very, very high value. So the collector will take them, they'll squash them, and they'll take them through to an aluminium recycler, and that person will sell them on to the resmelters. In South Africa at the moment, there is something around the aluminium can or collector can recycling association, but also the producers like Hewlett's Aluminium. And they've spent 300 million rand in putting in proper smelters that will bring that aluminium back into the system. And the reason why we want to do that, as opposed to exporting it, is because recycling aluminium saves 95% of the energy costs than it does to extract raw aluminium. And aluminium can be recycled over and over and over again. But we also need to design for recycling because aluminium comes in many different alloys. So same as with steel and iron comes in different types of alloys. Aluminium is in different alloys for its different applications. So you cannot use the aluminium from a recycled solar panel as the same product for aluminium in an aluminium can because they're very different. Once they've been formulated into an alloy, they then need to be resmelted back into that same alloy application. So you can't cross-match different alloys unless you're downscaling or downgrading. So there's a huge opportunity in terms of aluminium. And copper is also a great opportunity in an application. Maybe put it into perspective with rare earth elements. Rare earth elements, again, tantalum, niobium, platinum, tellurium, there's a whole suite of different materials are listed under what the European Union calls critical raw materials. And it's based on geopolitics. China owns currently about 70% of the conventional mining stocks for rare earth elements and rare earth metals. And that provides an imbalance in the world with regards to securing those materials. And yet we have so many opportunities under our noses, we've just forgotten about them. One of those is that if you look at one of our big waste products here, we have fly ash that comes from our coal mines. Effectively, what happens when we burn coal in a big coal-fired power plant is that we burn off the carbon and we create energy, but then we're left with an ash which has a high concentration of rare earth metals in it. And that can be anywhere between 0.8 and 1.4% of rare earth metals. So we have some very clever scientists in this country who are busy looking at different processes for separating the rare earth elements from our coal fines or our fly ash. And there are massive opportunities that could add billions and billions of dollars into our national economy on an annual basis. So we need to focus on those. There's an awful lot of fly ash around. We're producing about 40 million tons of fly ash a year. We have huge landfill sites, ash landfills that have been around for a long time. So there's a huge stockpile of these materials. So we need to extract those because from a critical resilience perspective, from an economic perspective, those attract way more value than your steel and iron. So we talked about last week, iron, we're mining 67 million tons of iron ore, but we're exporting 57 million tons of it. So we need to look at local beneficiation. The rare earth elements, we cannot afford to be throwing it away. So that's where the opportunity is for us to look at that. And electronic waste is another high value source of these critical materials as well.
Yeah. And with my understanding also, when it comes to metals also, especially when it comes to steel, I don't know if you covered that last week. Steel is one of the most sustainable thing on this planet also because of its durability. When it comes to aluminium, is it because it's lighter? That's the reason people have invested more into recycling aluminium? Is that are those the reasons?
Not really. I mean, the reality that they've used aluminium as a lighter materials from a packaging perspective, but also aluminium is used in multiple applications for lightweight framing and windows and other components. But aluminium is as good as steel in terms of any metal, really. Metals are the most recyclable product that you have because, with the exception perhaps of iron that will rust, but you can even recycle rust. Rust is just an oxidized iron; it's still iron. Aluminium doesn't rust, so there's a lot more recovery in terms of aluminium. But it can be recycled again and again and again, almost infinitely, without losing its potential and its strength, its engineering applications. So any metal is in the same. Gold is a metal, and gold you can recycle time and time again. And the fact is that we have an immense amount of gold in our electronic waste on our circuit boards as gold contacts. We have greater concentration of gold in e-waste than we do in any of our gold mines in South Africa. And yet we throw away 300,000 tons a year of electronic waste. And I think last year we were at about 10% of that from a recycling perspective.
This might be off question, but being from a consumer's perspective, I never knew the importance of metals until I owned a car that was on a higher value. And I don't know if you're the catalytic converter, if you're well familiar with it. And a lot of guys, I never knew why they are chasing this catalytic converters for the platinum on the inside. And because I never knew how you're going to take it out, how you're going to recycle it, but there's a lot of money in that. And people don't understand how much money is in metal also. In the side, people take it for granted.
Absolutely. Catalytic converters is a premium choice for any metal recycler, and everybody wants them. As you say, that they'll chase those things down. Platinum, palladium, the different platinum group metals are one of the highest value metals in the world. And even though there's such a tiny amount in a converter, catalytic converter, it's very economically viable to recycle those. So we also have PGM metals or platinum group metals in a lot of our electronic waste, and particularly in our computers, in our ICT waste, computers, cell phones, laptops. But it has multiple applications. If you look at these materials, not just the PGMs, but your rare earths like tantalum and cobalt. I mean, these are highly sought after in the military. Sorry, I was trying to think of the word. Military industry uses them enormously for these high-tech gadgets, such as the jet planes and instrumentation controls. So they're highly sought after, which is why you have this CRM application, critical raw materials, which is a policy in Europe. As to how to sustain and maintain and create independence on critical raw materials. They're rare. That's why they're called rare earth metals. They're not easy to find. So we've got to look at making sure that we recycle all of them, and at the same time look at other alternatives and opportunities, such as fly ash.
But is there a way that we can restrict guys from stealing metals? Because I understood that if you break aluminium, as it copper pipes or aluminium, when you break them, it's not reusable anymore. Is that still true, or do people still recycle and reuse those things? Or is there a way that we can stop metal theft and moving forward?
We've tried, Byron. It's a big issue. We looked at the implementation of the Second-Hand Goods Act, which came into force 2 or 3 years ago, and that really was to look at the critical issue around metals recycling. give you a prime example, Cape Town. If you look at the fact that they would steal the copper pipes for on the train tracks, the actual value of that copper is significant for the individual, because they can take that to a scrap metal recycler who should not be buying it, because you can very easily tell what is stolen copper and what is not. But the economic impact of the fact that the train's not going to work for 3 months because now you've got to replace all that infrastructure is 10, 20 times more than the value of the material that they stole. So there's also talk about looking at being a little bit harder from a regulatory and legislative perspective in cracking down on people who are stealing copper and aluminium, because it has massive ramifications from an infrastructure perspective. But containing it is really about working in with the metal recyclers. Any metal recycler will take any metal, and that's why the Secondhand Goods Act is there, is to ensure that whatever metal they're taking, they now need to know where that person got it from. They need to make sure that they have that person's ID, so they can track and trace wherever they can. But of course, with ID theft and ID fraud in this country, it's very easy for people to get around that. So they're trying, but it's a big issue. The applications in terms of copper and aluminium are a huge problem for the government and for businesses.
And are you familiar with who's the biggest metal suppliers in the world, though, at the moment, though?
Well, it depends on application. So, if you look at Africa, is by far the biggest resource of raw material metals in the world. So, and a lot of it is not being extracted at the moment. There's still huge potential in Africa. That's why we have a lot of interest from other governments, Russians and Chinese, who are trying to secure those critical raw materials for their own uses, and it's a geopolitical game. We need to show and push that Africa can be self-sufficient, which is where, if you go right back to one of the first talks we had from the circular economy perspective, the big push on the new Green Deal with the European Union is specifically looking at the problems that we have with regards to supply chains. So to now transport iron ore or copper ore or bauxite, which is the aluminium ore, all the way to Europe doesn't make sense, because A, it's costly, B, it's unreliable at the moment, and C, is the cost of energy in terms of converting that to the metal or extracting the metal out of the ore, which is high in carbon, it's high in energy. So there's a big push in terms of trying to drive economic development in Africa to make sure that Africa becomes more self-dependent in the beneficiation of those products, as opposed to just exporting ore. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and we need to cash in on that. Nolwazi, you got a question?
Yes, I do actually. Sorry to take you back, but then this is about what you mentioned when you spoke about e-waste, how Japan is also using some of the gold from e-waste. I think I don't understand why e-waste is an issue if it contains most of valuable metals. And also, if you take, like, because you mentioned that we can recycle gold like again and again and again, doesn't the quality of that gold decrease, or is it the same as raw gold that has just been extracted?
Yeah, well, gold is gold is gold, so it doesn't degrade. It's always got the same value. The issue in terms of recycling e-waste is, again, comes back to the problem of not having the right infrastructure in place to look at that extraction. We also don't have the right systems in place. So when we look at government departments or big corporates who are now trying to get rid of their 3-year-old computers, basically a lot of it just goes into trash, and they try and sell it to the first available person. What the electronic waste associations are doing in South Africa is to try and ensure that is done on a sustainable as well as a certifiable process, so that we can control the movement of metals. Part of the problem is that most of what's happening in South Africa is what we would call the lower tiers of electronic waste recycling. We do dismantling and refurbishment. We don't do much in the way of recycling. So there are small critical capacities. If you look at Rand refineries as an example, they have the capacity to look at a sort of a pyro extraction of these metals. But again, we don't have the top end that can separate out all the different metals. If I take a printed circuit board, there will maybe be 17 to 22 different metals in that circuit board. And what we have is the ability to maybe extract one or two of those. Whereas there are critical systems and infrastructures put into place in Italy, in Canada, in Japan, in China, that are able to separate out all of those different metals and extract them out. But those refineries are expensive. So putting in the investment into a refinery of that nature would depend very much on assuming that we could have the volumes that would justify that. So whether you're looking at hydrometallurgical or pyrometallurgical extraction of metals from electronic waste, it's an expensive process. And it would need to be defined on a critical mass of feedstock on a daily basis to justify the economic investment into that. So as I said, we've got 10% recycling on our e-waste at the moment, which means we need to get to not only 100%, but possibly also look at the opportunity of bringing in e-waste from our neighboring countries to try and get to the critical volumes that we need to justify the investment into a top-end refinery that'll be able to extract those different metals. So it's a bit of cat and mouse, chicken and egg, whatever you want to call it. It's we can put the infrastructure into place, but we can't justify the expense until we get the collection system sorted out. If you look at government, we're busy chatting to them at the moment about the issues on asset disposal. So a computer has a life of 3 years. After that 3 years, that computer has been written off in the books. It no longer has an economic value. And then it's supposed to go through into appropriate electronic waste recycling programs. But very few people know who those people are or how to contact them. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And that's why through the Section 18 of the Waste Management Act at the moment, we have now looked at electronic waste being one of the three extended producer responsibility systems that have been put into place because of the critical importance of those materials. So we need to improve our collection. And as we improve our collection, we improve our volumes. And as we improve the volumes, we can then justify the cost and the expenditure into the more expensive end of extracting those materials. Right now, most of what happens with our printed circuit boards is that they're sold on the open market. So even our biggest collectors, they're crunching them up and they're exporting them overseas. And that's what we're trying to avoid.
That's quite concerning. That's where the question I don't want to go back on what you said, because I asked you who's one of the largest producers, and I would think China's the largest producer, but who has these metals, and Africa is one of the greatest with raw materials and stuff. Is it lack of knowledge, lack of what do we lack that we don't, that we can't use our own resources, or is just the westernized government that has us in our has us in their pocket? What is happening in our country? Because I believe we do have the knowledge, we do have the materials to create wealth in our own continent. But what are we lacking actually? Is it just the powers that be that's pushing it towards that side? Especially metals is one topic. It just proves also.
Yes, it's not as simple as that. I mean, the reality is that there are vested interests. So, if you talk about Canada, who has invested billions of dollars into their refinery development, they don't want to lose their raw materials that are coming into that from all over the world. So it's not in their best interests to help support an initiative in Africa that's going to take away business from them. So there's a lot of business protectionism that's in the market, but there's also a lot of geopolitical movement in terms of CRM. So the ensuring your own supply of critical raw materials is probably one of the biggest geopolitical battles we're having at the moment, so almost like a silent war. And it's largely because of that imbalance. And if you look at China has got an estimated 70% of the rare earth metals at the moment, but they have the infrastructure and the financing and the backup to put behind it to extract those metals. But what we don't know is the full extent of where those metals are and the undiscovered resources thus far in Africa at the moment. If we look at the maps that are provided globally, they would say that South Africa is important from a PGM perspective. We have a higher volume of platinum group metals, as does Zimbabwe. But the DRC would be a critical element in terms of lithium for battery technology. Rwanda and the DRC are vitally important for tantalum, which is critical from a capacitor perspective in ICT capacitor development. So we need to map out what is where, but it's also, again, coming back to one of our previous shows, how do we work with this Pan-African trade agreement to start developing cooperation between African countries where we might not have enough materials in our country, but if we collaborated with 4 or 5 other African countries, and then share in the spoils of that, we would very easily be able to put these things together and become more powerful in terms of our control of materials into the world. At the moment, we're at the beck and call of the international prices. These are all based on the London Stock Exchange. We've got very little to do with that. So we've lost the power in terms of the control on the materials, and that's something which we need to change. But we also need to have a better understanding of metals, and that's why the second part of the show, because there's a lot more to it than steel. There's a lot of politics behind it. There's a lot of money behind it, and from a critical positioning perspective, the world is going green, and we need these materials. Whether you're looking at communications and technology and ICT, or whether you're talking about green energy, these are materials that are vitally important in terms of the stabilization of our green economy and our low carbon future. But we also need to understand the implications of that. Solar is not as green as we're just getting it from the sun. There are materials that are needed to capture that. Those need to be mined. Those need to be recycled appropriately. But obviously, the big difference between solar and coal is that you're not digging up the ground and spewing black stuff into the air and the massive impact of coal. But you still need to mine that aluminium from bauxite. You still need to mine the iron ore. You still need to mine the copper, the tantalum. So there's still issues, and that's why driving towards a circular economy is vitally important. That we don't let these vital products leak back into the environment or into our landfill sites, but rather that we have proper systems in place to harvest those and ensure that we minimize the impact on the environment.
Wow. You just took me back to another topic that Nolwazi brought to light, that the solar experience, that could have opened another can now, the solar experience, how sustainable it is. But before we go, I this might be thumb sucking, but on a poverty-stricken basis, more to an affluent area, I see a lot of poverty-stricken people do recycle metal more. Of course, the scrap and metal industry and so forth. Why is it as such? Is it because just for bread and butter, and the affluent areas like, I don't need this. This is petty change. Knowing that metal is needed to be recycled again. What is your thought on that?
Well, I mean, it's very simple. If you're collecting metal versus you're collecting paper or PET, which is heavier?
Of course, yeah.
So it's got a lot more weight behind it. It's got a very stable base. If you look at the metals market over the years has been very, very stable in terms of metals pricing, whereas the fluctuation with regards to fiber and plastic has been up and down like a yo-yo. So there's more resilience in the metals recycling market, but there's also always an international drive for that. So when China closed its doors on plastic recycling, they certainly didn't close the doors in metals recycling. So you can still export metals to China or to anywhere else. It's a supply and demand thing. Metals are just a far better way of maximizing your return. It takes a lot less energy to recycle a metal than it does to mine a virgin metal. And if you look at the big drive that China had with regards to their aluminium can, they were the biggest aluminium can recyclers in the world. When you speak to the economists in China, it was not about the aluminium. The focus was the energy. The fact that it took 95% less energy to recycle aluminium than it did to manufacture aluminium. So that what they were doing was they were actually importing an energy balance, not so much the aluminium. And that's a fascinating insight in terms of the understanding the economic dynamics of recycling and metals in the market.
Wow, brilliantly. Thank you again, Chris. We always enjoy all the insight that you have. Without you, we'll probably have a 2-minute show. I don't know.
I could carry on for
That's all we have. We've reached our time. But what I took away from it, supply and demand. That was one big taking I take away from it. Thank you, Nolwazi. Thank you, Chris. And we'll see you guys next week again with another topic. Hopefully, we have Gordon on board next week. He's going to be all well and ready. See you then. Bye-bye.
This show is brought to you by GBCSA's Positive Impact Magazine.
How do we grow this influence of black leaders, men and women, that can represent our industry inside the ANC, inside the policy making structures?
Get to grips with the digital environment, put together best practices, what works and what doesn't, very importantly.
In the project that we're doing in Catalytic, we've created a linking bridge between those two little areas there. So it becomes a matter of just 10 minutes walk from one side to the other.
So my message to our CEOs and those chief investment officers is, where at the end of the day do you want to see your role?
So by feeding all of our water back to a stage where we can bring it back into the process, we're in effect saving around about 35% of our water usage on site.